This time on Poll Hub, we're talking about brand new poll results from three states that haven't been terribly competitive in presidential elections for a long time. So why bother polling? Well, two reasons. One, this year could be different, and all three feature major Senate races that could decide which party holds the majority come 2025. Then, we're looking at a trend in education that has really never caught on in a big way in America, despite decades of research indicating it might be a very good thing for kids. We're talking about year-round schooling. What do Americans think of the idea, and where is it working now? Finally, it's October, so back to our fun fact. We're staying on trend, a spooky trend. Lee loves this one. Stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho. I'm Mary Griffith.
And I am Lee Marigoth.
So, Florida, Ohio, Texas. These are not states in our modern era that we say, wow, battleground states, mainly because they have turned pretty red. Democrats used to be competitive in Florida, haven't been competitive in Texas in most of our lifetimes, and we're competitive in Ohio, in the fairly recent past, but not so much anymore. Still, we wanted to go into those states, as we mentioned at the top, because this year could be different. And for a big reason, two of the Senate races, the only two Senate races where Democrats have a chance to take a seat from Republicans, are in two of these states, Florida and Texas. So we thought, let's dive in and see what we found. And what did we find?
Well, let's take a look starting out with Florida. What we see is that former President Donald Trump, among likely voters, has a 4-point lead over Vice President Kamala Harris. Trump receives 51% to Harris's 47%. We go down and we take a look under the hood at the crosstabs. What we see is Harris has the advantage against Trump among Black voters. However, she's not receiving nearly the same support as President Joe Biden did in the 2020 presidential election. Taking a look at white voters, we see that former President Trump is ahead of Harris among white voters, but he too underperforms the 62% that he received in the 2020 election. A 15-point gender gap exists here. A 12-point gender gap existed 4 years ago. So those are some of the key points that we're seeing in Florida. Lee, why don't you take it from there?
One of the reasons to take a look at Florida is the Senate race. As Jay mentioned, the Senate race in Florida is one of the states where the Democrats may need to find a Senate victory. And right now, with, I guess it's McChrystal Powell running against the incumbent Scott, who's the Republican, the numbers are 50 for Scott and 48 for the Democrat. So that is 2 points, razor thin edge for the Republican. So that's attracting a lot of attention now in the closing weeks of the campaign, because the Democrats look at numbers like that and they say, maybe they can score an upset, knock out an incumbent. One of the things that I think was really interesting in that is that Scott, and we'll see this also with Ted Cruz when we look at Texas, that Scott's favorable unfavorables at 44 to 55, so he's pretty much even, but with a negative that's equal to his positive. The Democratic challenger is more favorably received than unfavorably at 37 to 23, but 40% do not have an opinion on her. So what can happen? Well, she can define herself in terms with among those 40% that could close that 2-point gap, or the Republicans can define her tired of Biden, probably Harris in this instance, and preserve that seat. A 40% unsure about the candidate who's the challenger is not horrific, but it leaves on the table the potential for both a victory, upset, or getting the incumbent back in for the Republicans. So that's one we're going to be watching, and it deserves to be watched.
Yeah, I thought that 40% was huge. I mean, recognize this is a month out. I was really shocked about that number. And again, as you point out, it may be okay. Maybe the less you know, the more likely you are to vote for a candidate. And certainly Scott does have some negatives, but he's not over 50% on either side. So I think that is an interesting race.
Are either of you surprised in Florida, Ohio, and Texas on the presidential side? Are either of you surprised that these races don't appear to be particularly close? Because we remember, Florida has been, for the last two cycles, maybe Democrats can get it back. And Texas has been, it's going to turn purple someday. Are you surprised that this just doesn't look like a different election year than the last couple?
Yes and no, because in some of these states it has a large Latino vote, and the Democrat, Harris is not getting the share the Democrats should be getting among those. So that makes Florida and Texas less attractive than they might otherwise be, although she's doing better among white voters, I believe, in both of those states. The 4 points is still very much a close race. The 7 in Texas, I'd be surprised to see the Harris campaign go in guns a-blazing in Texas, because that seems to be a wider gap. Mary, do you want to go through the numbers?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to provide the overall top lines for Ohio and Texas because there's a lot to dig into here. In Ohio, we see that Trump has a 6-point lead over Harris, 52% to 46%. In Texas, he's leading Harris, as you mentioned, Lee, by 7 points, 53% to 46%. What's going on under the hood here?
I think one of the things I find very interesting as we go around the country talking to people in these states is how national this election really is, particularly in terms of the presidential campaign. And what I mean by that is you can really look at the demography of the state and whether it is a leaning Republican state or it's a leaning Democrat state, and really get a pretty good sense of what the overall head to head between Harris and Trump is going to be. We see a lot of very similar patterns as we look across this. In Ohio, independents divide between Harris and Trump, but not so much in Florida and Texas. We do see that when we have a state that has voted Republican in the past and is likely to do so again, independents generally tend to lean in that direction. And so I think that in Texas, I was struck by the fact that we, see Trump doing quite well among independents, and in Florida as well. I think, Lee, you also mentioned the fact that in Florida, you see a very strong Latino showing and support for Donald Trump. That is not unusual. I mean, we generally talk about Latinos as, one category, but as we know, it is an incredibly diverse group. Where people come from, they come from all over the world. And so in Florida, that is primarily a group of Latino Americans who have come from Cuba. They tend to be incredibly conservative. They identify with the Republican Party and have so for many times out. I remember, I think we were doing the 2012 election between Romney and Obama, and we had done Florida, and people thought we were crazy because Cuban Americans were supporting President Obama, which was the key to him doing well in that state at that time. But we see no such thing this time around. They are solidly in Trump's corner. We see similar numbers, not to the degree that we do in Florida, but certainly similar numbers in Texas as well. And as we polled other states, I'm thinking of Arizona, we have seen that trend moving forward.
So the other Senate race, Mary, is the Texas one that is catching some attention here. Colin Allred, big football player, up against Ted Cruz, who has had some famous kind of gaffes in Texas, including going to Cancun when there's a big storm. But he has been in trouble before, allegedly, in the past. What do our numbers show this time?
So what we see is Ted Cruz, the Republican incumbent, has 51% among likely voters. Allred has 46%. What's interesting here, though, is when we take a look at the favorability ratings of the two candidates, Ted Cruz is viewed favorably by 46% of Texas residents. 46% have an unfavorable view of Cruz, so they divide. However, Allred, he has low name recognition in the state among residents. 25% of Texans have either never heard of him or are unsure how to rate him. His positive score sits at 39%, and his negative sits at 36%. So there's little consensus. What do you make of the low name recognition for Allred, and how could that impact the race in the final weeks of the campaign?
I think it's very similar to Florida in that the incumbents are Cruz and Scott, the two Republicans. They're favorable, unfavorable is identical for all intents and purposes. And the challengers need to kind of close that name recognition gap and still to be defined. So we'll see if the money pours in at the end as the Democrats increasingly look for a seat that they probably need to pick up on and aren't right now necessarily assured of either of these, but they're going to be, I'm sure, hunting around for it. One of the things I think is interesting also in looking at the Senate and looking at the presidential in these two races, that the Democrat for the Senate is getting pretty much what Harris is, and the Republicans for the Senate are pretty much getting what Trump is. So there's not a lot of crossover voting. But I'm setting the table, Mary, for Ohio, because that's a different picture.
So when we take a look at the Ohio Senate race, what we see is that the Democratic incumbent Sherrod Brown has the support of 50% of likely voters, and his Republican challenger Bernie Moreno receives 48%. We take a look at independents. Brown has a wider lead, 54% to 43% for Moreno. Jay, what's your take?
So this is a guy much like Ted Cruz in Texas, who you look at him and you go, how does he win? When in his case it's some unfavorability problems. In Ohio, it's like, how does this guy win? This state has really gone very red. It's a red state now. It's not a purple state anymore. And how does Sherrod Brown keep winning? And you're looking at these numbers and you're saying, well, this is how he keeps winning, right? He's got the Democrats, although the Democrats are not a majority in that state by any means. He peels off a little bit of Republicans, but it's the independents. It's the people in the middle, and they like him. I think part of his appeal is that he's a real kind of hair tousled blue collar guy, and he's the kind of guy who can, I think, win in a Republican state in the same way that Republicans can win in a Democratic state if they appeal to a certain kind of cross section of especially independent voters. And I think Sherrod Brown's a good example of that. They are a vanishing breed, though, Lee, as we've talked a lot of times, that the Senate now is composed mainly of senators of the same party that the voters in that state vote for president.
And this would be an exception if, in fact, Trump carries it and then Brown were to win that. One point on this, and then someone can wrap it up, is that Moreno has an upside down favorable, unfavorable. He's the Republican challenger. We didn't see that with the Democratic challengers in Texas and Florida, but he's at 37 to 44. His negatives are actually higher than Brown's. We're very pleased to have with us a colleague from polling years back, when Maris joined with the Wall Street Journal to do a series of battleground states. Aaron Zittner, who is a reporter editor in the Washington Bureau. Aaron, welcome to the podcast. Very happy to have you here. You have recently, with some colleagues, wrote an article, Americans are more reliant than ever on government aid. And it talks about the aging population and economic distress, often in manufacturing areas, people getting older. And eventually, I bet we end up talking about the presidential campaign and what's going on. But let's first talk about what you have talked about in this article about the reliance on government aid as people like me get older.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. We all know that the nation is aging. The share of Americans who are seniors is up around 18%, and it's headed toward 25 in the next few decades. And we know that the cost of retirement and healthcare for seniors is very high. And because the government has Social Security and Medicare, the costs borne by the government are high and are a big contributor to national debt. What this project did is it reflected not just that America is aging, but it looked at where the effects of aging hit hardest, in the sense that if you're in a community that has a lot going on, that has a lot of economic vitality, the money that comes in from the government, and let me define the terms. We use the word aid. The term of art here is government transfers. Government transfers is a Bureau of Economic Analysis, federal definition for all kinds of stuff. Earned income tax credit, child tax credit, Obamacare, healthcare subsidies, all kinds of money flows that go from the government to support people and for which the government doesn't get an aircraft carrier in return or a service in return. It's outflows from the government. And because we didn't want to use the word transfers, our project said these are social service programs or safety net programs or aid. And what it does is it looks at, for any given county, how much money is coming in as a transfer or as aid compared to the other economic activity in that county. So if you're in Manhattan, you might have a whole lot of dollars coming in from the federal government, but it's going to be a drop in the bucket compared to all the other economic activity. But if you're in Appalachia, there isn't a lot of other economic activity. There isn't a lot of economic income generated from jobs, wages, salaries, from investments, from wages, from the organic economic activity of that county.
And that's where you're really targeted, I think, this analysis, right? More rural areas.
This is a project about place, and it's a visual project, and we're on a podcast. So this is really a project where the picture tells all the words. So when you look at all the counties in America, and we picked a benchmark of 25%. I know we're throwing a lot out here, but let's define our terms. If 25% of all economic income, all income in a county, came from the federal government in the form of earned income tax credits, Social Security, Medicaid, all these outflows. If 25% of all economic activity came from the federal government, that county lights up on our map. And in 1970, less than 1% of counties met that benchmark. And they were mostly Appalachia, some Native American lands, rural South, but it was a tiny share. You get to the year 2000, and about 10% of counties light up. Now, this is where the picture tells 1,000 words. When you see that map of 2000 and the number of counties that need federal aid for their economic vitality changes to the year 2022, bam, the map of America is lit up all over. 53% of counties meet this benchmark for being significantly reliant on these federal outflows for a meaningful share of their economic activity.
I think one of the things that was really interesting about this as well is that these are measures that have been done the same way pretty much over the decades. So it does provide a foundation for being able to look at this over time. You mentioned a couple of the numbers during the 1970s. Has this been an incremental change in your eyes and your estimate? Or, for instance, are there moments in the data where you see these explosions like we did around COVID and 2022?
I'll answer that with more of a supposition. When you look at this map and you see this explosion from the year 2000 to the year 2022 in the number of counties, I think what you're looking at is a map of things that we know and have written by using in other lenses. The rise of China as a world economic power, China's admission into the WTO, the effects of NAFTA to a lesser degree. To me, this is a map to a large degree, not just of poverty in America, rural poverty and inner city poverty, Appalachian poverty, Native American poverty. It's a map of deindustrializing America, a map of what we sometimes call left behind America, and it's a map of Trump friendly America. What we do after we show you these counties that are so reliant, we show you how they vote. And the increase in counties, the big uptick in the number of counties that we determine to be significantly reliant, they are overwhelmingly, they are almost entirely counties that are voting Republican or that have shifted Republican. This is a map of voters who feel left behind, shifting to Republicans and shifting to Donald Trump. But the irony here is these places, because they have relatively unvibrant organic economies, are more reliant on federal money.
Yeah, given we don't have the visual, I would like to just list a couple of the top states here, because I think it is very interesting. Because when you think of government aid, you don't necessarily think of these larger transfers. I'm thinking specifically of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, which have been part of an estimation of income for quite some time in the definition of how the United States measures how we're doing, at least individually. Not in terms of GDP. But just for instance, we do think of West Virginia as not being an economic place that is driving the economy of the United States. And over 70% of counties fit your criteria. Next is followed by Mississippi, Arkansas. Then we find Maine, but then that's followed by Alabama, Kentucky. And also I found very interesting because this next state, New Mexico is top of the list usually in many areas when we look at government aid and government support. It's not just because of the lack of economic drivers there, but also the government, how large the federal government is as part of their economy as well. How much of a surprise did you feel when you were going into this research?
Well, but I should say the actual data was produced by a think tank in town called the Economic Innovation Group, a bipartisan policy group that thinks a lot about geography, place-based policies to improve the economy. When I saw this map, yes, there's Appalachia, there's New Mexico. The political implications jumped out at me. The first is you look at all these counties, And I know counties don't vote. Counties count votes, and we're about to get into a lot of county by county vote county discussion in this
Yeah,
election.
that may be a whole
But
nother segment.
yeah, but but you look at this map and you say, no wonder we have a presidential campaign in which neither candidate is talking about austerity. And in fact, they're only talking about expanding the social safety net. Donald Trump is not only defending Social Security and Medicare from cuts, but saying, hey, let's not even tax Social Security benefits, which expands the safety net and moves forward the date of insolvency. Kamala Harris has a range of policies around expanding the Affordable Care Act and the child tax credit. So, one, it explains the conversation. But two, you look at where these states are, all of northern Michigan, pretty much, except for a few wealthy enclaves. Northern Wisconsin, about 60% of the counties in Pennsylvania, 13 out of 15 counties in Arizona. When you go to the swing states, big portions of the swing states are very reliant on federal aid. And this is where the battle of the campaign is. Donald Trump has gone 5 times to the same arena in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, a highly reliant county. In each of his 3 campaigns for president, he's gone to Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where the steel industry collapsed. That is one of the most highly reliant counties in the state of Pennsylvania and the country. The candidates are going to these places because this is where there are a lot of voters. A lot of them are lower propensity voters, and they're trying to gin up the vote in these
Yep.
kind of left behind places.
This is absolutely, I think, a critical analysis because I think people try to explain the whole Trump MAGA movement in terms of it being a cult, that there's some magic that Donald Trump has this magic cult hold on people. But what you're saying here, as this is built on a very sound economic understanding of what's gone on to the baby boomer generation, many of whom we've seen in polls like Gallup and others who say that people just don't think the benefits are going to be there for themselves. And we see a Republican Party that used to be very fiscally conservative. Now, as you indicate, both parties, Trump and Harris, both candidates are talking about expansive support, funding it differently, but with serious implications for the budget and the debt going forward. So I just think that this is just like fascinating to look at. Democrats carry a lot of blue areas in very dense areas, but the Republicans get a lot of the real estate, a lot of the acres.
I think you made a really good point too, Lee, about the fact that we forget to look at a lot of the other issues that were really the foundation of Trump's support. And I remember in 2016, a lot of the research that we did at that time is that many people who had voted for Trump had actually voted for Obama as well. They were attracted to that economic message. And so, when we look at other survey research, although people feel that government aid to the poor does more good than harm, 55% feel that way. I think those numbers are somewhat lower than they have been in the past. But 65% of Americans believe that it is the government's responsibility to ensure that Americans do have health care. 79% say Social Security benefits should not be reduced in any way. And I think it really speaks to the fact of what you're pointing out, Aaron, that it's really all become interconnected. From your experience, you've covered this for a long time. Do you see any changes to our economic situation here in the U.S. that might change the direction of these numbers, or have we become too reliant on government aid to kind of make up for places where the economy is not functioning or is transitioned and not been replaced?
I'm not quite sure how to answer. In some ways, the map you see here is a map of thriving metropolitan America, although, Detroit and Milwaukee light up as heavily reliant, Philadelphia, heavily reliant, metropolitan versus non-metropolitan America. My thoughts go to, what do these places want? Trump went to Johnstown, where the steel industry has just collapsed and devastated that area. Huge population loss, business loss. What you're left with is older people left behind and younger people walking away for opportunities elsewhere. He went in 2016 and said, I promise to bring the steel industry back. Well, now it's 8 years later. He goes back to Johnstown. The steel industry hasn't come back, and he's still a hero. What do these places want? A lot of them don't seem to want more immigration. Immigration brings vitality a lot of the time. Look at what the fight over Springfield, Ohio, where immigrants are working. They don't seem to want, rural broadband isn't going to be the thing that is satisfactory. And I don't know what they want, but the last thing I'll point out is look at today's Republican Party and look at our map. J.D. Vance comes from one of the poorest counties in Appalachia, if you accept his story that as he told it in his convention, that his real heart, his ancestral homeland isn't in Ohio, but is in eastern Kentucky. That is one of the most reliant counties in the whole country. Look at Jason Smith, Republican head of the Ways and Means Committee, comes from a part of Missouri that is one of these very reliant places. The Republican Party now is stocked not with the Mitt Romneys, but people who come from some of these places. And I'm not sure what policy is going to be devised that they think is going to satisfy and lift some of these places.
We have to thank you very much for adding a whole new perspective to understanding some of these political dynamics. So we see lots of stuff about swing states, and we really, in this case, zero in and target what's going on within these different geographic areas within these states. A place to look for and better understand what's going on, because ultimately that's the important thing. Aaron, thank you. Aaron Zintner of the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much for helping shed a little light on all this.
Oh, good to be with you. And it's nice to reconnect with you, Lee and Barbara, from our old polling days. And maybe we work together again.
Okay, the theme for Halloween continues through October. We do elections, we do Halloween. So this is by Lifetime Television, 1991. Now, here is something that you can all weigh in on. If someone you respected told you that they had communicated with a dead person, would you believe him or not? 41% of Americans then said yes, 47% said mm-mm, and 9% were sort of like on the fence. Maybe. They went maybe on it. So I'll say right now, no, I'm not going there. I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense. And so I will say I'm in the plurality of not believers. Barb, what do you think on this one?
Well, I think I would probably fall in the maybe realm. And I have stated this, and you may hear this going forward too. And Lee, I might just argue that politics is pretty scary. So yeah, it's not just Halloween.
We're all on theme, yeah.
But I think that the sciences have shown us, particularly our physicists and those who study time and light, that time, may not be what we think of it as at this point in time. No pun intended, please. Well, I definitely, I really adhere to the fact that I think that there is a lot that we don't know about the physics of time. And it's still open to that kind of experimentation, exploration, and understanding. So you may be talking to someone, not necessarily in the present or in the future, but having a conversation at another time.
I just had Abe Lincoln on the phone, but I'll get back to him later. Mary, where do you go with this?
So I fall in the maybe category with Barb, but for a different reason. If we're talking about communication, what type of communication? I mean, you may not hear someone's voice talking to you, but does something fall off of a shelf when you're thinking of a person, or does, you find a note or something? So I think it comes down to the type of communication. And then again, who am I to question what people believe in terms of, what's going on in their life?
Yeah, that's kind of where I feel like if somebody this is predicated on somebody you respect, if they say no, I'm not going to tell them, no, you're crazy, or I don't believe you. I'm not going to do that. This is interesting though, because the numbers are different than last week when the question was more, do you believe in witches and ghosts and all this kind of stuff? This is somebody else doing it. And I think Barb's point is really well taken, and was last week too. And that is, yeah, we think we know everything about everything. And, we're consistently proven as humans that we know very little about anything. And so do I believe that I'm going to hear from somebody who's dead? No. Do I absolutely believe somebody tells me that? That they heard somebody or talked to somebody or whatever? I'm not confident enough that in our knowledge as humans to say that. So I'm in that 9%. I can't believe the 9% was so small in this one. This is one where I would have thought it would have been like 50% in the middle. What do I know?
Maybe they went past that. Someone who said, and they thought of whether you think it, they just sort of went on past it. Well, we will continue. It's not my phrase, but someone once said of Halloween polls that Marist poll could become the scariest poll during the month of Halloween. So we will continue with the Marist poll, or on this theme, it could be the scariest poll. Anyway, we'll talk to you next week.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Hunter Petro and Neil Viswanathan.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.